Okay guys, for this video I wanted to walk you through a lab that we'll do on fossils and interpreting fossils. And for this lab we'll kind of do it together. So if you follow along in the video and use the documents that are in Google Classroom, you should be able to have success with the lab, I think. I wanted to point out to you before we get started though, here's the bottom right corner of your reference table, and right there is the Eurypterid, which I mentioned in one of the last videos. The common name for this is a sea scorpion, or Eurypterid, or here's the specific species name for this type of Eurypterid. There were many different types of Eurypterids, different species, but this particular species is the New York State fossil. And we can see these paddle-like arms for swimming through the water. Again, these creatures lived on the seafloor, and they would swim along the seafloor and kind of scurry along the seafloor, kind of like a crab or a lobster. And they had a pointy stinger on the back, and that's why they're called sea scorpions. Extinct, no longer alive, but they are the New York State fossil because they've been found in large numbers in western New York, out in like Buffalo, Rochester area. So not too much around here, more in the western part of the state. But because we have many Eurypterid fossils, it is our state fossil. Okay, so let's take a look at the lab now. And the lab has really three parts to it. This lab is from your lab book, and it's called Interpreting Ancient Environments Using Fossils. Now, we'll take a look at more fossils. I'm going to attach a scanned copy of the lab for you, but I'll also have a Google document where you can type on it. So the vocabulary, the questions, and everything will be in a Google document also. So if we take a look at Procedure A, the first part of this lab says to study the diagram of fossil footprints, which is on the next page. On a separate paper, write a short story explaining your interpretations of the sequence of events which occurred. Your story should include the evidence upon which you base your inferences. So if we take a look at the footprint diagram, and again you have this as a separate document, you'll be able to type up your story. Now I want to give you some things to think about. Okay, so here's a list of things to consider when you look at these footprints. So basically the idea with this part of the lab is to analyze the footprints and to try to create a story of what might have happened. You know, remember, footprints are often fossils, the impressions of creatures, trace fossils we would call them. And you basically need to look at the footprints and create a story about what might have happened, but the story has to match the evidence that you see in the diagram. So some things to think about would be, well, what kind of animals were involved? Were all the tracks made at the same time? How many animals are represented by the tracks? What is the scale of the diagram? We have no sense of scale. Maybe these footprints are really big, maybe they're really small. What direction of movement is indicated by the tracks? How many legs did the animals have? Did the animals have tails? Did the wind change direction or speed? Maybe wind played a role here. What caused the footprint pattern to change? Was the land level? Was this a hill or a slope? Was the soil wet or dry? And lastly, something to think about would be, what was the probable climate of the area? These are questions that geologists might ask themselves, or specifically paleontologists, if they were to encounter actual footprints, tracks, fossil trackways in the ground. So the first part of this lab is to analyze these trackways, pretending that they're actual fossil footprints. Try to answer some of those questions or address some of those questions. No need to address all of those questions. Okay, so just those are some ideas to get you started. I think that you should be able to do this with a paragraph or two, something like that. So anyway, think about those questions and try to create a story that would match the evidence that you see here. Let's take a look at the next part of the lab now. So now the next part of the lab involves some fossils. And I again happen to have more fossils. I was thinking about this lab last night and remembered I had another box of fossils in my attic and spent a few minutes digging them out. So we'll do this chart together. There's a similar chart in a Google document that you can type right into. So you don't necessarily need to print this out and write on it like I'm doing. You can do that on your own. So let's go through some fossils now. I'll put fossils again under the projector. Each fossil has a letter, number, code, and we're not going to go in particular order. So the numbers are not necessarily going to be in any real order or anything like that. So here's our first fossil. Let's take a look at this one. Its number, its letter number is F9. So I'm going to write F9 here. Again, though, you can type that directly into the document. Now, if we take a look at the fossil, well, here we have what's called a bivalve, meaning a creature with two shells. This is a filter feeder, so it sucks in water. It's obviously a marine creature, lives in the water. We have two shells coming together, kind of like a clam, but again, the two shells are different. The top shell is not the same as the bottom. And if that's a little confusing, well, we have the seam between the two halves of the shells right here. And we can see the top half is much larger than the bottom half. So the two shells are not the same. This makes this a brachiopod. So this is a fossil brachiopod. Here we can see it from this angle. So now we're looking at it from the front. Here we're looking at it from the side. Here would be a top view. And for the drawing of the fossil, well, you're going to have to do that on separate paper. Okay, so you're going to have to do your drawings on paper, or you could print this lab out if you have a printer and do it right on the lab like I'm doing. I'm not going to take the time to draw the fossil. That's something that you could do on your own. I would use pencil for your drawing if you can. Pencil usually works out a little better. You can erase and everything. Now, this would be a brachiopod, so for identification, we'll say brachiopod. And for method of fossilization, let's say mineral replacement. The shell and the minerals that make up the shell have been replaced over time by minerals in the seawater, slowly turning this into a rock. And there's our brachiopod again. Okay, so that was sample number F9. Let's take a look at the next one. The next one is F1, and again, the numbers are not going in order. If we take a look at this one, well, we have a portion of an animal. We don't have the entire creature. Remember that many times when organisms die, their bodies disintegrate really quickly. Scavengers spread their remains around, and it's actually very unusual to find an entire organism. Anyway, this is a portion of a trilobite. And here we can see the head of the trilobite here. So this is the head part. And here's a part of its body. The rest of the body would have been down here, and it would have had a tail part, but that is missing. And remember, trilobites were creatures that lived on the seafloor, kind of related loosely to modern-day horseshoe crabs, but they would crawl around on the seafloor. They've long been extinct, but they would crawl around on the seafloor looking for food and tasty things to eat. So again, you're going to do a drawing, and you could do the drawing on a piece of paper, or if you have access to a printer, you can print this whole thing out and do it that way. Either way is fine. And here I would also say mineral replacement. Minerals in the seawater have replaced the organic material making up the trilobite's shell. And again, this is a trilobite. Here's the next one. This is F4. Now, F4 is kind of an interesting one. It almost looks like honeycomb or something like that. All of these little polygons here, essentially. And it's interesting actually when I look at these, I'm not sure if they all have the same number of sides. And again, it's important to make these simple little observations. Let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm seeing some with 4 sides, some with 5 sides. It's kind of interesting. But this is a piece of coral. Coral sometimes becomes fossilized, or often becomes fossilized, I guess I should say. And coral is a very common fossil. I mentioned in another video, coral is a colony of animals. Each one of these little holes is kind of like an apartment in an apartment building. And each little hole would be filled with an individual little coral polyp or coral animal. And when the coral is alive, it would be filled with individual little coral creatures making up a colony of coral. So coral is not one animal. Coral is many animals living in a community. So here we have fossilized skeletal remains of the coral building. The inhabitants are gone. So again, do your drawing. Again, I'm going to say mineral replacement here, which is a very common way that fossils form, so that's why we're seeing this so much. And that would be coral. Here's one here. The numbers on the back. This is F12. There it is there. You could do your drawing. And we clearly have a fossil of fern. We looked at that large, oops, I said fern. We clearly, we saw that large fossil fern that I have in another video. Here's a similar piece. This is from Pennsylvania, and we have the carbon remains of the fern on the surface of this is shale. So this is a carbon replacement, or carbon film form of preservation. I think I'm going to stop the video here and take a quick break for some water, and then we'll do the remaining fossils, and we'll look at the third section of the lab. So I'm just going to stop here. I'll start again in just a few minutes.